The early years of my life were unremarkable. Or at least I used to think so. Looking back, I realize that sometimes, ordinary memories take on a new weight as you grow older. What once felt like happy, normal days with my father eventually unraveled into a complexity I couldn't have foreseen. My father was a proud man, one who was well liked in our small town. He had this effortless charm, the kind of charisma that made everyone lean in when he spoke. For as long as I could remember, people treated him with a strange sort of reverence, respect, and admiration. Yes, but also a fear I couldn't quite place as a child. He could make anyone feel comfortable, or at least appear to be comfortable. But there was a line that he guarded closely, a line he didn't like anyone to cross, even unknowingly. Growing up, I didn't see his charm as anything special. He was simply my father, warm in his quiet way, steady, and always reliable. He would take me fishing by the lake, just the two of us, surrounded by the thick summer heat and the hum of cicadas. We wouldn't talk much, just let the gentle breeze and the lazy sunlight fill the silence between us. Sometimes he'd tell me stories, little bits of wisdom wrapped in metaphors I was too young to fully understand. I remember thinking of him as someone who knew important things. Things that adults understood but kids had to wait to learn. But for all his quiet strength, there was something else, something harder, a quality that didn't sit as comfortably in my mind. He had a way of speaking about people. Certain people, that made my stomach twist. Though I didn't fully know why back then. He had certain words he'd use, certain tones, that made me instinctively quiet. It was as if he knew there was a place in his heart that he couldn't let others see. A darkened room kept locked. As a kid, I tiptoed around that place, feeling a vague discomfort that I'd later come to understand was fear. One memory, in particular, sticks with me. I must have been around 10. Maybe 11. My father and I were out getting groceries. Just an ordinary Saturday afternoon. We passed a group of people who had just moved to town. And I remember hearing the whispered comments that slipped from his mouth. They weren't loud, barely audible in fact, but his words lingered like smoke. Thick and stifling. There was a bitterness in them. A kind of resentment that felt out of place for the man I thought I knew. I remember wanting to ask him why he said those things. Why he looked at them like they were somehow less than us. But the look in his eyes told me that questions were not welcome. So I kept quiet. As I grew, these little moments began to accumulate like pebbles in a stream. Alone, they didn't mean much, but together, they formed a weight I couldn't ignore. I'd be lying if I said I fully understood the implications of his words back then. I was a child, just trying to make sense of the world as best I could. But even as young as I was, I sensed something was wrong. There was a sharpness in his tone, an underlying anger, directed at people who hadn't done anything to deserve it. The older I got, the more I realized that my father's bitterness was not a passing thing but a part of him. A part that shaped his entire view of the world. In high school, my unease grew. By then, I had friends from all backgrounds. People my father would never have approved of if he had known. I kept those friendships hidden, worried about how he'd react if he knew. But as my own world expanded, my father's felt more and more closed off, confined to a narrow set of beliefs and boundaries that I couldn't understand or accept. He held on to his views with a fierce pride, as if they were a part of his identity that couldn't be questioned. And maybe they were so deeply embedded in him that he couldn't separate himself from them. Even if he'd wanted to. My father had become a man whose views were set in stone. Unmoving, unyielding, and I, his only child, was becoming someone who couldn't look past those views. It was a gradual shift, this slow pulling away, but it was also inevitable. The father I had loved as a child felt like a stranger to me now. Someone I couldn't quite reach. We were still cordial, still played the roles of father and child, but there was a distance between us that grew with every passing year. Then came college. Moving away felt like a breath of fresh air, like I was finally free to grow in ways I hadn't been able to under his watchful eye. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who challenged my ideas, who encouraged me to question everything I'd been taught. It was liberating, but it was also terrifying. I felt as though I was unraveling, losing parts of myself that I'd thought was solid and true. I had to rebuild, piecing together a new identity, one that was separate from my father's influence. But even as I was building this new life, he was still there, a shadow in the back of my mind. Every time I went home for the holidays, I felt the tension creeping back, the unspoken rift between us growing wider and wider. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to confront him. Part of me wanted to believe that he'd change, that he'd come to understand why I felt the way I did. But deep down, I knew that was wishful thinking. My father was a man who held onto his beliefs with a grip so tight it left no room for compromise. It wasn't until my final year of college that the breaking point finally came. Though looking back, I think it was only a matter of time. I went home for Thanksgiving, expecting the usual awkward silences and careful conversation. But that year was different. My father was more vocal than usual. His words harsher, his tone more biting. He seemed to be in a mood that I hadn't seen before. A kind of simmering anger that sat just beneath the surface. We were at the dinner table. The room quiet except for the clinking of forks and knives. I don't remember what started it. Some comment on the news. Perhaps. But it escalated quickly. My father began to speak about outsiders. About how they were ruining the country. How they were taking everything we'd worked so hard for. His words felt like poison. Each one sharper than the last. I sat there, silent, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what to say. But as he went on, something in me snapped. I couldn't sit there, couldn't pretend to agree with him any longer. I remember setting down my fork, my hands trembling as I looked him in the eyes. I tried to tell him how I felt, tried to make him see why his words hurt me, why I couldn't support his views any longer. But he didn't listen. He dismissed me, told me I was too young to understand. That I was just a product of the liberal nonsense they taught in schools. That was the moment I knew. I knew I couldn't keep pretending. Couldn't keep pretending that I was okay with his beliefs. That I could look past them and still see him as my father. The man I had once idolized was gone. Replaced by someone I couldn't recognize. Someone I couldn't respect. And so, I left. I packed my things and walked out of that house, feeling as though I was leaving a part of myself behind. It was the hardest decision I'd ever made. But it was also the first time I felt truly free. As I drove away, I felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. A weight lifted from my shoulders even as my heart ached with loss. I had cut ties with my father, and there was no going back. Leaving my father's house that night was like shedding a heavy coat after a storm. But once that coat was off, I felt the chill of exposure, as if I was standing alone in a new world without the familiar warmth of home or family to shield me. I drove through the quiet streets, my hands gripping the wheel as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I felt a surge of anger, sadness, and relief all at once. A strange mix of emotions that I couldn't put into words. All I knew was that I couldn't turn back. At first, I thought that leaving would bring me peace. I told myself that cutting ties with my father was the right thing to do. That it would finally allow me to live authentically, without the constant weight of his beliefs pressing down on me. But the reality was far more complicated. The silence that followed our estrangement was deafening. I felt as though I had stepped into a void, a place where the familiar markers of family and identity were suddenly absent. It was a disorienting, lonely feeling, one that left me questioning everything I thought I knew. I kept to myself during those first few weeks, avoiding calls from my mother and ignoring the messages from friends back home. I couldn't bear to explain myself, to try and make others understand the depth of the rift that had formed between my father and me. Instead, I threw myself into my work, spending long hours at the office, trying to drown out the ache in my chest. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the thoughts that crept in at night, when the world was quiet, and I was left alone with my memories. The hardest part was the guilt. Even though I knew, logically, that I had done the right thing, a part of me still felt like I had betrayed my father. Like I had abandoned him when he needed me most. I remembered the way he had looked at me that night, a mixture of anger and disappointment in his eyes that I couldn't forget. It haunted me, that look, as if he was silently accusing me of turning my back on him. And in a way, I had walked away from the man who had raised me, the man who had once been my hero. I had chosen to protect my own beliefs, my own values, over my relationship with him, and that choice weighed heavily on my heart. For a while, I tried to find comfort in the people around me. My friends, my co-workers, they all supported my decision, assuring me that I had done the right thing, that I was brave for standing up for what I believed in. But their words felt hollow, unable to fill the emptiness that had settled inside me. They didn't understand the complexity of what I was going through, the years of love and loyalty that had led up to this moment. To them, it was simple: my father had crossed a line, and I had reacted accordingly. But to me, it was so much more than that. It was a lifetime of memories. A bond that had been built over countless small moments. Now fractured beyond repair. I began to question my own values, wondering if they were worth the pain they had caused. Was my need to stand up for what I believed in truly worth the cost of losing my father? Couldn't I have found a way to make peace with his views? To look past them and still love him as I once had? These questions haunted me, gnawing at the edges of my mind, making me doubt myself in ways I hadn't before. I felt as though I were adrift, untethered from the foundation that had once grounded me. It was around this time that I started having nightmares. They weren't dramatic, nothing like the scenes you'd see in a horror movie, but they were unsettling in their own quiet way. In my dreams, I was always a child again, standing alone in my father's house, surrounded by familiar objects that somehow felt wrong. The rooms were empty, the walls cold, and I could feel my father's presence even though I couldn't see him. I would wander through the empty house, searching for him, only to find myself back at the beginning, trapped in a loop that I couldn't escape. Each time I woke up, my chest felt tight, my mind clouded with a sadness I couldn't shake. One morning, I received a letter from my mother. She had been quiet since I left, respecting my need for space, but now she seemed to be reaching out, trying to bridge the gap that had formed between us. In her letter, she spoke about the family, about how much she missed me, and about how hard this rift was for everyone. She didn't take sides, she never had, but her words carried a subtle hint of hope, a suggestion that maybe, one day, things could go back to the way they were. Reading her letter made me ache with a longing I hadn't realized was there. I missed her, missed my family, missed the life I had left behind. But I knew, deep down, that going back wasn't an option. The damage had been done, and there was no way to undo it. I wrote back to her, trying to explain my side, to make her understand why I had made the choices I did. I told her about my struggles, about the nights I spent questioning myself, about the guilt that weighed on me like a stone. I poured my heart out onto the pages, hoping that she would see the pain behind my decision, that she would understand that this wasn't easy for me either. But even as I wrote, I knew that words could only do so much. She would read my letter, she would try to empathize, but she would never truly understand. How could she? She was caught in the middle, torn between her loyalty to my father and her love for me. And I couldn't blame her for feeling conflicted. As the months passed, the pain began to dull, settling into a quiet ache that I learned to live with. I focused on building my new life, on carving out a space for myself in this unfamiliar city. I made new friends, found a job that I enjoyed, and started to feel a sense of purpose again. But even as I moved forward, a part of me remained rooted in the past, tied to the family I had left behind. I carried that weight with me everywhere I went, a constant reminder of the choices I had made and the price I had paid for them. Then, one day, everything changed. It started with a notification on my phone, a message from an old friend back home. I hadn't spoken to them in years. Not since I left, but their words were brief and urgent, laced with a sense of foreboding that made my stomach twist. "Have you seen what your father's been posting?" they asked. At first, I didn't understand. My father had never been one for social media. He'd always dismissed it as a waste of time, a distraction from real life. But curiosity got the best of me, and I found myself scrolling through his profile, my heart pounding as I read his posts. What I found was a nightmare come to life. There, in plain view, were posts filled with accusations, hurtful words that painted me as a traitor, a disappointment, someone who had abandoned their family for selfish reasons. My father had taken our personal conflict and turned it into a public spectacle, framing me as the villain in a story he had crafted to suit his narrative. He spoke of my betrayal, of my disloyalty, casting himself as the victim of a child who had turned their back on family values. The words felt like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. It wasn't just the posts themselves that hurt, it was the comments. The people rallying around him, offering their support and sympathy. They didn't know the truth, didn't understand the complexity of our relationship, but they believed his words, taking his side without question. Friends, neighbors, even distant relatives, people I had once trusted, were now condemning me, calling me ungrateful, selfish, lost. It was as if my entire world had turned against me, as if everything I had built in my new life was crumbling beneath me. I tried to stay calm, to remind myself that these were just words, that they couldn't hurt me if I didn't let them. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. The anger and sadness that bubbled up inside me. My own father, the man who had once been my hero, was now leading a campaign against me, using his words to poison the minds of everyone around him. It was a kind of cruelty I hadn't expected. A level of spite that left me feeling hollow and broken. For days, I didn't know what to do. I avoided social media, shut myself off from the world, retreating into the safety of my apartment. But the damage had already been done. People from my hometown began reaching out, some offering support, others condemning me, echoing the sentiments they had read in my father's posts. My phone became a source of anxiety, each new notification a reminder of the storm that was brewing around me. In the quiet of my apartment, I found myself questioning everything once again. Had I made a mistake? Was I truly the person my father painted me to be? A selfish child who had abandoned their family? The doubts crept in, dark and insidious, threatening to pull me under. I wanted to scream, to reach out to him and beg him to stop, to make him see the pain he was causing. But I knew that would only fuel the fire, giving him more ammunition to use against me. So, I stayed silent, waiting for the storm to pass, hoping that eventually, people would move on and forget. But deep down, I knew that this was just the beginning. My father wasn't going to stop, not as long as he believed he was in the right. And I was left with the bitter realization that I was fighting a battle I couldn't win. The days following my father's first posts were a blur, a mix of sleepless nights and an endless loop of checking my phone, hoping it would all just disappear. But the posts kept coming, each one sharper, more vicious than the last. My father had taken on a role he seemed to relish: the wounded parent, betrayed by an ungrateful child. He painted our story in black and white, simplifying our complicated relationship into a narrative that suited his needs. In his eyes, he was the victim, and I was the villain who had turned against him without reason. At first, I tried to keep it to myself. I didn't want to burden my friends or bring them into the mess my life had become. But as the days wore on, the pressure became unbearable. I could feel the weight of the words pressing down on me, a suffocating force that left me gasping for air. The messages I received only added to the pain. Some were from strangers who had seen my father's posts and felt the need to chime in with their own judgments, while others were from people I had once called friends, expressing disappointment, confusion, or, worse, anger. I hadn't anticipated how deeply his words would cut, how they would seep into every part of my life, making me question everything I thought I knew about myself. I had left home to find freedom, to live a life that aligned with my values. But here I was, shackled by the weight of my father's campaign, unable to move forward. It was as though he had reached through the screen, pulling me back into his world, refusing to let me go. One evening, as I sat in my dimly lit apartment, scrolling through the latest wave of hateful comments, I felt something inside me snap. I couldn't keep going like this. Couldn't keep pretending that his words didn't affect me. I needed help, needed someone to understand what I was going through. So, reluctantly, I reached out to a friend, Maya, one of the few people who had been by my side since I left home. She was someone I trusted, someone who had always been there for me, no matter what. When I told her about what was happening, about the posts and the messages and the way my father had turned the people in my hometown against me, she listened quietly, her face etched with empathy. She didn't try to offer solutions or tell me that everything would be okay. She simply listened, letting me pour out the pain that had been building up inside me. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of relief, a small glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could get through this. Maya's support became a lifeline, a thread that kept me grounded as I navigated the storm. She encouraged me to take a break from social media, to step back and focus on the things that mattered: the friendships I had built, the life I was trying to create. It wasn't easy. Every day, I fought the urge to check my father's page, to see if he had posted something new, to read the comments and try to make sense of the things people were saying about me. But gradually, I learned to resist, to push those thoughts aside and focus on the things that brought me joy. For the first time in months, I began to feel a sense of peace, a fragile calm that I clung to desperately. I spent time with the friends I had made in the city, throwing myself into work and hobbies, trying to rebuild my life from the pieces my father had left behind. I found comfort in the small moments: the laughter shared over coffee, the warmth of a friend's hand on my shoulder, the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. These moments became my refuge, a sanctuary from the chaos that had taken over my life. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't fully escape the shadow of my father's words. They lingered in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the person he believed me to be. It was as if his voice had taken root inside me, planting seeds of doubt that sprouted and grew in the quiet moments when I was alone. I began to question myself, wondering if maybe, just maybe, he was right. Had I truly abandoned my family? Was I as selfish as he claimed? These doubts gnawed at me, eroding the confidence I had once felt, leaving me hollow and uncertain. In the midst of this turmoil, I received a call from my mother. She had been quiet throughout all of this, staying on the sidelines, trying to keep the peace as best she could. But now, her voice was filled with a sadness I hadn't heard before, a deep, aching sorrow that made my heart ache in response. She told me that she missed me, that she wished things could go back to the way they were. She didn't take sides, didn't condemn me for my choices, but her words carried a weight that left me feeling guilty all the same. She was torn, caught between her loyalty to my father and her love for me. And I knew that my decision had put her in an impossible position. As much as I wanted to reassure her, to tell her that everything would be okay, I couldn't find the words. The distance between us felt too great, a chasm that neither of us knew how to bridge. After that call, the loneliness became almost unbearable. I had lost my father, and now, I felt as though I were losing my mother too. I had once believed that cutting ties with my father would set me free. But instead, it had left me adrift, isolated from the family that had once been my anchor. I found myself longing for the comfort of home, for the familiar warmth of my mother's embrace, for the sound of my father's voice, even if it was filled with words I couldn't bear to hear. But I knew that going back wasn't an option. The damage had been done, and there was no way to undo it. As the weeks passed, I struggled to find a way forward. I tried to focus on my own life, on the friendships I had built and the goals I had set for myself. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the weight of my father's campaign. It was as if his words had woven themselves into the fabric of my life, a dark thread that I couldn't untangle. One night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized that I had reached a breaking point. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, caught between my past and my future, haunted by the words my father had spoken. I needed to find a way to make peace with myself, to let go of the guilt and the anger and the sadness that had been consuming me. I knew that it wouldn't be easy, that it would take time and effort and more strength than I thought I had. But I also knew that it was the only way to move forward. So, slowly, I began to let go. I stopped checking my father's page, stopped reading the messages and comments that had once filled me with dread. I focused on the things that brought me joy, on the people who had stood by me through it all. I threw myself into my work, into my friendships, into the life I was trying to build for myself. And, gradually, the pain began to fade. It wasn't a quick process, nor was it easy. There were days when the weight of it all felt too heavy to bear, when the memories of my father's words threatened to pull me under. But each time, I found a way to keep going, to remind myself of the reasons I had chosen this path. I was learning to live with the scars, to accept the parts of myself that had been shaped by my father's campaign. And in that acceptance, I found a kind of peace, a fragile sense of self that I had never felt before. As time went on, the campaign lost its momentum. People moved on, distracted by other dramas and controversies, and the spotlight shifted away from me. My father's posts became less frequent, his words losing their bite as the weeks turned into months. I knew that the pain he had caused would never fully disappear, that the scars he had left would always be a part of me. But I also knew that I was stronger than I had once been, that I had survived his words and come out the other side. In the quiet moments, I would sometimes think of him, of the man he had once been and the man he had become. I wondered if he ever thought of me, if he ever felt regret for the things he had said. But I knew that these questions were futile, that I would never get the answers I sought. All I could do was let go, to move forward and build a life that was true to who I was, regardless of the family I had left behind. And so, that's what I did. I focused on the present, on the people who loved me for who I was, on the goals I had set for myself. I learned to find joy in the small moments, to appreciate the beauty of a life that was mine to shape. And in that journey, I discovered a strength I hadn't known I possessed, a resilience that carried me through the darkest days. Just as I began to find my footing, to settle into some semblance of peace, my father reignited his campaign. It was sudden, a jarring shift after months of relative calm. One morning, I opened my phone to find notifications, an uncharacteristic flood of alerts from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Messages ranged from confusion to outrage, from support to scorn, all directed at me in response to a series of posts my father had published. His new posts were not subtle, nor were they limited to veiled criticisms or indirect commentary. This time, he had escalated his attack to a level one hadn't anticipated. He'd begun naming me directly, calling me out as someone who had betrayed her family, spat on tradition, and discarded the values that he claimed had been his life's work. His words were harsh, bitter, laced with a deep-seated resentment that sent a chill through me. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. He had turned his focus squarely onto me. With each new post, he sharpened his accusations, painting a picture of me as someone who was lost, misguided, and ungrateful. He spoke of me as if I were a stranger, as if I hadn't spent the majority of my life by his side, following his teachings, trying to be the daughter he had wanted. His words cut deeply, each one a reminder of the love that had once existed between us, now twisted into a weapon aimed at my heart. And the people, they listened. They responded. Friends of his, people I barely remembered from childhood, even extended family members whom I hadn't seen in years, they all began to weigh in. They commented on his posts, echoing his sentiments, offering their condolences and support. They praised his strength for enduring the supposed heartbreak I had caused him. And the more they praised him, the more he posted, feeding off the attention, off the validation of his beliefs. It wasn't just the online comments either. Soon, the harassment bled into my real life. I began receiving messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Each one a variation of the same message. How could you do this to your father? Don't you care about your family? You've changed, and not for the better. Some of the messages were laced with pity, others with anger, and still others with a strange sort of curiosity, as if they were trying to understand how I could have fallen so far from grace. It became nearly impossible to ignore. The constant barrage of messages, the flood of notifications, the whispers that seemed to follow me wherever I went, they all left me feeling exposed. As if my entire life had been laid bare for the world to see. My father had taken our private conflict and turned it into a public spectacle. A stage for him to perform his own version of our story. And I was left powerless. A silent character in a play I hadn't agreed to participate in. The impact on my personal life was swift and severe. Colleagues at work began to act differently. Their once friendly smiles replaced with guarded looks and whispered conversations that stopped when I walked into the room. People I had once considered friends began to distance themselves. Their silence a painful reminder of the power my father's words held. It was as if he had cast a shadow over my entire existence, darkening every corner of my life. I tried to keep my head down, to focus on my work, to remind myself that I was more than the person he claimed me to be. But the weight of his words pressed down on me, a constant reminder of the family I had lost, of the people who had once loved me but now saw me as a stranger. I felt as though I were being torn apart, pulled in different directions by forces I couldn't control. In moments of desperation, I considered responding, crafting a post of my own to counter his narrative, to tell my side of the story. But each time, I hesitated, unsure if engaging would only make things worse. I didn't want to turn this into a public battle, didn't want to feed the drama that my father seemed so intent on creating. And yet, staying silent felt like a concession, as if I were allowing him to rewrite our story, to shape the world's perception of me with each new post. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me, a suffocating force that left me gasping for air. I realized that I couldn't keep going like this, couldn't keep letting my father's words dictate my life. I needed to take back control, to find a way to move forward without letting his anger and resentment define me. It was then that I decided to seek help. I reached out to a therapist, someone who could offer me an unbiased perspective, who could help me make sense of the tangled mess of emotions that had taken over my life. It wasn't an easy decision. Part of me felt ashamed, as if seeking help were a sign of weakness, an admission that I couldn't handle this on my own. But deep down, I knew that I needed someone to guide me, to help me find a way through the darkness that had settled around me. In those early sessions, I struggled to put my feelings into words. I spoke about my father, about the love and respect I had once felt for him, about the pain of watching him turn against me. I talked about the guilt, the anger, the sadness that filled every corner of my mind. My therapist listened patiently, offering gentle guidance, helping me untangle the web of emotions that had ensnared me. Through our sessions, I began to see my father's campaign for what it truly was, a projection of his own pain. His own inability to accept that I had chosen a path different from his own. His anger, his bitterness, his need to paint me as the villain. These were not reflections of who I was, but rather reflections of his own insecurities, his own fear of losing control. It was a painful realization, but also a liberating one. I began to understand that his words didn't define me, that I didn't have to carry the weight of his anger on my shoulders. With this newfound clarity, I started to rebuild. I focused on the things that brought me joy, on the people who had stood by me through it all. I reconnected with friends who understood my situation, who offered their support without judgment or expectations. I threw myself into my work, finding solace in the tasks that allowed me to feel productive, to feel like I was making progress, even if only in small ways. And gradually, I began to heal. The wounds my father had inflicted would never fully disappear, but I was learning to live with them, to carry them as a part of my story without letting them define me. I was learning to accept that I couldn't change him, couldn't force him to see me as I truly was. All I could do was live my life, to find happiness and fulfillment on my own terms, regardless of his beliefs or his words. In the quiet moments, I still thought of him, still felt the pang of loss that came with the knowledge that our relationship would never be the same. I missed the man he had once been, the father who had taught me to fish, who had shared stories by the lake, who had made me feel safe and loved. But that man was gone, replaced by someone I could no longer recognize, someone who had chosen his pride over his family. As the months passed, my father's posts became less frequent. The fervor of his campaign began to fade, the attention of his audience shifting to new topics, new dramas. I knew that he would never fully let go of his anger, that he would always carry a piece of resentment for the daughter who had dared to defy him. But I had found a way to let go, to move forward without carrying the weight of his words. I had survived his campaign, had weathered the storm and come out the other side stronger than before. And in that survival, I found a strength I hadn't known I possessed, a resilience that carried me through the darkest days. I was no longer defined by my father's words, no longer shackled by the expectations he had placed upon me. I was free, truly free, to live my life on my own terms. And for the first time in years, I felt at peace. The calm I had found was fragile. Although my father's posts had slowed down, the impact of his campaign continued to ripple through my life, an aftershock that seemed endless. I told myself that time would heal, that the worst was behind me, but I quickly realized that the damage he had done would linger much longer than I'd anticipated. The scars ran deep, far deeper than I wanted to admit, and even though I had taken steps to distance myself from the pain, it still felt as though I was walking through the wreckage of a life that had once been whole. In small, unexpected moments, the memories of his words would resurface, catching me off guard, pulling me back into the darkness I had worked so hard to escape. A comment from a coworker, an offhand remark from a stranger, a chance encounter with someone from my hometown, each one a trigger. Each one a reminder of the person he had painted me to be. I would find myself doubting, second-guessing, wondering if there was any truth to his accusations, if I had truly become the selfish, misguided child he claimed I was. I struggled to push these thoughts aside, to remind myself of the journey I had undertaken, of the strength I had found in standing up for my beliefs. But no matter how hard I tried, the weight of his words pressed down on me, a constant, unyielding pressure that left me feeling exhausted and broken. I was moving forward, yes, but it felt like a hollow victory, as though I was simply going through the motions without ever truly escaping the shadow of my past. One afternoon, as I sat alone in a crowded cafe, I felt a wave of anger rise within me, a fierce, burning anger that left me breathless. It was a new sensation, one I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. I had spent so much time trying to understand my father's perspective, trying to empathize, to forgive, to let go of the resentment that had been simmering inside me. But in that moment, I realized that I was tired of being understanding, tired of shouldering the weight of his anger, of constantly making excuses for his behavior. I wanted to scream, to shout, to release all the pent-up frustration and pain that had been building inside me for so long. I wanted him to know, to truly understand, the impact of his words, the damage he had caused. I wanted him to feel the weight of the pain he had inflicted. to see the scars he had left on my heart. But I knew that confronting him would only bring more pain, more hurt, more anger, and I was done giving him that power. Instead, I turned to my therapist, pouring out the anger and frustration that I had kept bottled up for so long. She listened, her eyes filled with empathy, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. Together, we worked through the pain, the resentment, the deep-seated anger that I had buried beneath layers of guilt and sorrow. She helped me see that my father's actions were not my responsibility, that I was not obligated to carry the burden of his words, that I had the right to protect myself, to distance myself from the toxicity he had brought into my life. It was a slow, painful process, one that forced me to confront the parts of myself that I had long ignored. I had always seen myself as a dutiful daughter, someone who respected her family, who valued loyalty and tradition. But in rejecting my father's beliefs, in standing up for my own values, I had stepped outside that role, redefining myself in ways that were both liberating and terrifying. Through therapy, I began to understand that my father's anger was not about me, but rather about his own fears, his own insecurities, his own inability to accept a world that was changing faster than he could keep up with. His campaign against me was an attempt to hold on to the past, to cling to a version of reality that no longer existed. And while I couldn't change his perspective, I could choose how I responded, how I let his words affect me. Gradually, I started to reclaim my life. I set boundaries, both emotional and physical, that allowed me to protect myself from his influence. I limited my contact with people from my hometown, cutting ties with those who couldn't respect my choices, who continued to see me through the lens my father had created. It was painful, a kind of mourning for the life I had once known, for the relationships that had shaped me, but it was also necessary. A step toward healing, a step toward reclaiming my own identity. As I distanced myself from the past, I found new sources of strength, new people who accepted me for who I was, who valued me for the person I had become. I surrounded myself with friends who shared my values, who understood the struggles I had faced, who offered their support without judgment or expectation. These friendships became a source of comfort, a reminder that I was not alone, that I was not defined by my father's words. And with each passing day, I grew stronger. The pain, the anger, the resentment, they still lingered. Shadows that would always be a part of my story. But they no longer controlled me, no longer held me captive. I had found a way to live with them, to accept them as a part of my journey without letting them dictate my future. One day, as I sat in a quiet park, watching the sunlight filter through the trees, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. It was a fleeting moment, a brief respite from the chaos that had consumed my life. But it was enough. In that moment, I realized that I had finally let go, that I had finally moved beyond the pain my father had caused. I was free, truly free, to live my life on my own terms. I didn't need his approval, didn't need his validation. I was enough, just as I was. And that realization filled me with a quiet strength, a resilience that carried me through even the darkest days. I knew that I would always carry the scars of my past, that my father's words would always be a part of my story. But they no longer held power over me, no longer defined the person I had become. I was stronger than his anger, stronger than his resentment, stronger than the pain he had inflicted. And in that strength, I found a sense of purpose, a sense of direction that had been missing for so long. The journey had been long, filled with pain and heartache, but it had also been a journey of self-discovery, of growth, of resilience. I had faced my father's wrath, had survived his campaign, had come out the other side with a newfound sense of self. And in that survival, I had found a strength I hadn't known I possessed, a strength that would carry me forward, no matter what challenges lay ahead. As I left the park that day, I felt a sense of closure, a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. I was ready to move forward, to embrace the life I had built for myself, to live authentically, without fear, without regret. I had survived the storm, had weathered the backlash, and now, finally, I was free. The journey to peace was not straightforward. There were moments when it felt like I was merely circling back to familiar patterns, haunted by the echoes of my father's words, the shadow of his disapproval. But for every step back, I seemed to take 2 steps forward, finding a new layer of strength each time I stumbled. My life had changed in subtle ways. The pain and anger had softened, replaced by a steady resilience. A kind of quiet assurance that I hadn't known before. There was something profoundly freeing about no longer living under the weight of someone else's expectations. I had spent so much of my life trying to fit within the mold my father had created for me. Constantly afraid of disappointing him, of failing to live up to his ideals. Now, for the first time, I was free to define my own path, to make choices based on my own values and beliefs. One of the first things I did was reconnect with parts of myself that I had set aside over the years. I took up painting again, a hobby I had loved as a child but abandoned when my father dismissed it as impractical. I found joy in the colors, in the brush strokes, in the simple act of creating something that was uniquely mine. It was as if, with each stroke of the brush, I was reclaiming a part of myself that I had lost along the way. I also began to explore new interests, things I had never considered before, simply because I had always been so focused on meeting my father's expectations. I tried my hand at hiking, at yoga, at cooking new recipes that I had once thought too exotic for my tastes. Each new experience felt like a small victory, a reminder that I was in control of my own life, that I was free to shape my own identity without fear of judgment. And through it all, I found a new community, people who accepted me for who I was, who valued me for the person I was becoming. These friendships were unlike any I had known before, built on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding, without the need for pretenses or expectations. I felt a sense of belonging, a sense of connection, that I had once thought impossible. These were people who understood my journey, who supported me without question, who offered their love and kindness without asking for anything in return. For the first time, I felt truly seen, truly valued, in a way that transcended family bonds. It was a strange feeling, bittersweet in its own way, a reminder of the family I had left behind. I would sometimes think of my father, wonder if he had found any peace, if he still carried the bitterness that had once consumed him. But those thoughts no longer held the power they once did. They were just that, thoughts, memories of a past that I had left behind, a life that no longer defined me. With each passing day, I felt myself growing stronger, more certain of the path I had chosen. I was building a life that was my own, a life filled with joy, with purpose, with a sense of fulfillment that I hadn't known before. It wasn't a perfect life, there were still moments of doubt, of sadness, of loneliness, but it was real. And it was mine. And in that life, I found peace. It came slowly, in small moments, like the warmth of sunlight breaking through clouds. I would be sitting in a quiet cafe, sipping my coffee, and suddenly feel a profound sense of contentment, a quiet joy that filled me from the inside out. Or I would be out with friends, laughing, sharing stories, and realize that I was no longer haunted by the weight of my past. I was free, truly free, in a way that I hadn't known was possible. The peace I found wasn't a grand, sweeping revelation. It was subtle, gentle, like a whisper that lingered in the back of my mind. A reminder that I had survived, that I had come out the other side stronger than before. I had faced my father's anger, his resentment, his attempts to control my life, and I had emerged with a sense of self that was unbreakable. A resilience that carried me through even the darkest moments. As the months turned into years, I found myself reflecting less on the past, less on the pain my father had caused. I had forgiven him, not for his sake, but for my own, as a way of releasing the hold his words had once held over me. Forgiveness, I learned, was not about condoning his actions, but about freeing myself from the anger and resentment that had weighed me down for so long. In letting go, I found a kind of peace that transcended forgiveness. It was a peace that came from within, from the knowledge that I had done the right thing, that I had stayed true to myself, even when it had meant losing the people I loved. I had chosen a path that was difficult, painful, and lonely at times, but it was a path that had led me to a life that was filled with meaning, with purpose, with a sense of authenticity that I hadn't known before. I knew that my relationship with my father would never be the same, that the rift between us would always be a part of my story. But that rift no longer defined me, no longer held the power it once had. I had found a way to live with it, to carry it as a part of my journey without letting it control my future. As I moved forward, I felt a sense of closure, a sense of peace that I had once thought impossible. I was no longer the person I had been when I left home. No longer the child who had struggled to meet her father's expectations. No longer the young adult who had been weighed down by guilt and anger. I was someone new, someone who had forged her own path, who had built a life that was true to her own values. her own beliefs. And in that life, I found a freedom, a strength, that would carry me through whatever challenges lay ahead. I had survived the storm, had weathered the pain and loss. And now, finally, I was ready to embrace the future, to live a life that was filled with joy, with love, with purpose. For the first time, I felt whole, complete, at peace with myself and my choices. I knew that I would always carry the scars of my past, that my journey would always be shaped by the family I had left behind. But those scars were a part of me, a reminder of the strength I had found, the resilience that had carried me through. And as I looked forward, I knew that I was ready to face whatever came next, to embrace the life I had built, to live with a sense of purpose, a sense of peace, that would carry me through even the darkest days. I had found my peace, my freedom, my strength, and in that discovery, I had found myself. As the years passed, the weight of the past continued to lift, a gradual lightening that allowed me to breathe more deeply, to step more confidently into each new day. I had once thought that the pain of my father's betrayal, of his campaign against me, would linger forever, a shadow that followed me through every experience. But time has a way of softening even the deepest wounds, of turning scars into quiet reminders rather than daily burdens. I came to realize that my journey had not only been about escaping his control or finding my own voice. It had also been about learning to trust myself, to believe that I was worthy of a life filled with joy, with purpose, with love. My father's disapproval had cast a long shadow, but over time, I had learned to stand in my own light, to embrace the parts of myself that he had tried to suppress. With this new confidence, I began opening myself to the possibility of a different kind of family, a chosen family. One built on mutual respect and shared values rather than on blood and obligation. My friendships deepened, growing into relationships that felt as strong and resilient as any family bond. These friends had been by my side through the darkest times, offering their support without judgment, without conditions. They had seen me at my lowest, had helped me find my way back to myself, and their presence in my life was a constant reminder that love and loyalty could come from choice, not just from blood. Through these friendships, I began to find a new sense of belonging, a new community that embraced me for who I was, without the weight of expectations or the need to fit into a particular mold. These people became my family, my support system, my source of strength. With them, I felt a kind of love that was unconditional, a love that was not dependent on meeting anyone's standards or living up to anyone's ideals. It was freeing, this knowledge that I was accepted, valued, loved, just as I was. And yet, even as I built this new life, there were moments when the past would resurface. A whisper of doubt, a pang of nostalgia, a fleeting sadness for the family I had left behind. But those moments no longer held the power they once had. They were simply reminders of a life that had shaped me, but that no longer defined me. I had made peace with the past, with the choices I had made, and I was ready to move forward, to embrace the new chapter that lay ahead. One day, as I was going through some old boxes, I came across a photograph from my childhood, a picture of my father and me, sitting by the lake, laughing, our faces alight with joy. I stared at the photograph for a long time, memories flooding back, both good and painful. I remembered the warmth of his embrace, the sense of safety I had felt in his presence, the love that had once bound us together. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel that loss, to mourn the relationship that had once meant everything to me. But as I looked at the photograph, I also felt a deep sense of gratitude for the memories. Yes, but also for the journey that had brought me to this place of peace and self-acceptance. I understood, perhaps for the first time, that my father's influence had shaped me in ways I hadn't fully realized. His beliefs, his expectations, his disapproval, they had all been obstacles that I had overcome, challenges that had forced me to find my own path, to stand firm in my own truth. In a strange way, his rejection had given me the strength to embrace my own identity, to live authentically, without fear of judgment or rejection. And for that, I was grateful. Even if our relationship had ended in pain and distance, I had found a kind of resilience, a strength that came from within. And that was something no one could take away from me, not even him. As I tucked the photograph back into the box, I felt a sense of closure, a quiet acceptance that filled me with peace. I no longer needed his approval, his validation, his love. I was whole, complete, just as I was, and that realization filled me with a profound sense of freedom. In the years that followed, I continued to grow, to build a life that was filled with purpose, with joy, with a sense of fulfillment that I hadn't known was possible. I pursued my passions with a newfound enthusiasm, embracing each opportunity, each challenge, with an open heart and a clear mind. I traveled, explored new places, met people from all walks of life, each experience a reminder of the vastness of the world, of the endless possibilities that lay ahead. And in this new chapter of my life, I found love, true, unconditional love, a love that was built on trust, on respect, on a deep understanding of each other's journeys. This love was different from anything I had known before, a love that accepted me for who I was, without the need for change or compromise. It was a love that supported me, that celebrated my strengths and accepted my flaws, a love that made me feel seen, valued, cherished. With this love, with this new family, I felt a sense of belonging that I hadn't known was possible. I was no longer defined by my past, no longer haunted by the shadows of my father's expectations. I was free to live my life on my own terms, to embrace the person I had become, to love and be loved without fear. As I stood on the threshold of this new chapter, I felt a sense of anticipation, a quiet excitement for the future that lay ahead. I knew that there would be challenges, that life would not always be easy or straightforward. But I also knew that I had the strength, the resilience, to face whatever came my way. I had survived the storm, had come out the other side stronger, wiser, more compassionate, and I was ready to embrace whatever life had in store. I was no longer bound by the past, no longer haunted by the weight of my father's words. I had found my own path, my own purpose, my own peace, and in that discovery, I had found myself. This new chapter was mine to shape, mine to define, and I was ready to live it fully, openly, with a heart that was whole, a mind that was clear, and a spirit that was unbreakable. For the first time in my life, I was free, truly, completely, beautifully free, and as I looked forward, I knew that this was only the beginning.